The autumn winds swept across the Salt Lake Valley with a bitter coldness that seemed to penetrate the very bones of those who dared venture outside after sunset. In the year 1871, the territory of Utah remained a harsh and unforgiving land, where survival hinged as much on the unyielding strength of one's back as it did on the fragile thread of faith that bound the scattered settlements together. The valley stretched wide and desolate under a sky often bruised with gray, the air carrying the scent of pine and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke from distant hearths. For the pioneers who had carved out lives amid the rugged terrain, each day was a testament to endurance, their existence shaped by the relentless cycle of labor and prayer. Among these outposts of humanity, the Lefetti compound stood as a stark anomaly, a beacon of prosperity amid the wilderness, yet cloaked in an isolation that whispered of secrets. Ezekiel Lafferty had built his empire on the foundation of divine revelation and an unwavering devotion to what he proclaimed as the true principles of their faith. His property sprawled for miles, a vast expanse of fertile farmland where golden wheat swayed in the autumn breeze, grazing pastures where cattle lowed softly against the horizon, and a main house that rose like a fortress against the jagged backdrop of snow-capped mountains. The structure was an imposing edifice of weathered stone and timber, its steeply pitched roof dusted with the first snows of the season, its windows glinting like watchful eyes in the fading light. The compound was more than a home. It was a self-sustaining world, housing not only Ezekiel's immediate family but also several spiritual wives and their children. A practice that, while controversial even among their own people, was tolerated due to his towering standing in the community. His voice carried weight in church councils, his counsel sought by elders across the valley, and his wealth, a product of shrewd land deals and tireless labor, lent him an aura of invincibility. Sarah Whitmore arrived at the compound 3 months earlier, a wisp of a girl barely 16 years old, her heart still raw with the grief of losing her parents in a wagon accident that had claimed their lives on the treacherous trails west. The memory lingered like a shadow, the creak of splintering wood, the scream of horses, the sudden silence that followed as dust settled over the wreckage. Orphaned and alone, she had been taken in by her uncle Thomas Whitmore, a stern but well-meaning man who saw the Lefetti family as a refuge for his niece. He had arranged her placement with them, believing it would provide her with security and the spiritual guidance she so desperately needed after her loss. What he did not know, and what Sarah would come to understand only in fragments, was that Ezekiel had specifically requested her presence after observing her at Sunday services. Her pale blue eyes, wide with innocence, and her quiet demeanor had caught his attention, stirring within him a conviction he attributed to divine will. On her first evening at the compound, Ezekiel had summoned her to the dimly lit parlor, a room heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and the faint musk of aged leather. His weathered hands, roughened by years of toil, rested on her slender shoulders as he spoke with a gravity that seemed to fill the space. "The Lord has revealed to me that you possess a special calling, child," he intoned, his voice a deep rumble that resonated with the authority of a prophet. "You have been chosen for a sacred purpose that will ensure your eternal salvation." Sarah had nodded obediently, her blue eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, the flames dancing in their depths like tiny, trapped spirits. "The Lord has revealed to me that you possess a special calling, child," he intoned, his voice a deep rumble that resonated with the authority of a prophet. "You have been chosen for a sacred purpose that will ensure your eternal salvation." Sarah had nodded obediently, her blue eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, the flames dancing in their depths like tiny, trapped spirits. She had been raised to respect authority, especially that of church elders, and Ezekiel's reputation as a man of God preceded him throughout the valley. His words carried the weight of scripture, and she felt the burden of his expectation settle upon her like a mantle. The other women of the household, his wives Rebecca, Martha, and the young Constance, had welcomed her with warm smiles and gentle words, though Sarah soon noticed a peculiar reticence in their demeanor. They rarely met her eyes directly, their gazes skittering away as if guarding some unspoken truth. Rebecca, a woman in her 30s with lines of care etched into her face, offered a maternal embrace that felt more like a shield than a comfort. Martha, perhaps 25, moved with a serene grace that masked a quiet intensity, while Constance, only 19 and just 3 years Sarah's senior, carried a weariness in her eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. The children, a gaggle of small faces ranging from toddlers to adolescents, darted around the house with the energy of youth. Yet even they seemed subdued, their laughter tinged with an undercurrent of caution. The first weeks passed peacefully enough, a rhythm of routine settling over Sarah's days. She helped with household chores, scrubbing floors until her knees ached, kneading dough for the day's bread, mending clothes with needle and thread, while tending to the younger children, whose sticky hands and curious questions briefly distracted her from her grief. It was during these gatherings that Sarah first noticed the peculiar intensity in Ezekiel's voice when he spoke of spiritual purification and divine mysteries accessible only to the initiated. The world outside these walls is filled with corruption and false teachings, he would intone, his deep voice echoing through the room, the words reverberating off the wooden beams. But here within this sacred space, we practice the true principles that will lead us to the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom. The other family members nodded in solemn agreement, their faces illuminated by the warm light, their expressions a mixture of reverence and resignation. Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of these sessions, the repetitive prayers and hymns creating a hypnotic atmosphere that seemed to transport her to another realm entirely. The cadence of the chants, the rise and fall of Ezekiel's voice, the soft rustle of skirts as the women shifted. These sounds wove a tapestry that enveloped her, dulling the edges of her sorrow. She began to feel a sense of belonging, a fragile hope that this place might indeed be her salvation, as Ezekiel had promised. It was on a particularly cold October evening, the wind howling outside like a mournful spirit, that Ezekiel first approached her about what he called the deeper mysteries. The household had retired for the night, the children tucked into their beds, their soft breathing the only sound in the stillness. Sarah was finishing her evening prayers in the small room she shared with 2 of the younger girls, her knees pressed against the rough wooden floor, her lips moving silently over familiar words. The flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows across the walls, the flame guttering as a draft slipped through the cracks. She heard a soft knock at her door, a sound so gentle it might have been a whisper. "Sister Sarah," came Ezekiel's voice, barely above a breath. "The Lord has instructed me to speak with you privately. Please come to my study." Her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, Sarah wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, the wool scratchy against her skin, and followed him down the darkened hallway. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step a reminder of the house's age and the weight it carried. The study was a spacious room lined with religious texts, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless hands, and illuminated by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and wax, the silence broken only by the occasional pop of the candle's flame. Ezekiel gestured for her to sit in a chair across from his desk, his expression grave and contemplative, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "What I am about to share with you, child, must never be spoken of to those who lack the spiritual maturity to understand," he began, his eyes fixed intently on her face, their gaze piercing through the dim light. "There are sacred ordinances revealed only to the most faithful that prepare the soul for the highest blessings of eternity." Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows lengthening as if to listen. "I understand, Brother Ezekiel. I want to be worthy of whatever the Lord requires of me." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, a flicker of satisfaction that sent a shiver down her spine. "I knew from the moment I first saw you that you possessed the pure heart necessary for this calling. Tomorrow evening, after the family prayers, you will begin your preparation for the first sacred ordinance. Sister Rebecca will explain what is required of you." As Sarah returned to her room that night, the candle's flame extinguished with a soft hiss. She felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension coil within her. The hallway stretched before her, its darkness pressing against her senses, the cold seeping through the soles of her shoes. She had always yearned to feel closer to God, to experience the divine revelations that seemed to come so naturally to those around her. If Ezekiel truly had been chosen to receive these sacred mysteries, then perhaps this was her opportunity to achieve the spiritual enlightenment she had always sought. Yet, beneath that hope lay a thread of unease, a whisper of doubt she could not yet name. The wind outside moaned against the windows, a sound that seemed to echo the turmoil stirring in her soul as she climbed into bed, the blankets offering little warmth against the chill of the coming night. The next evening arrived with a stillness that belied the storm brewing within the Lefetti compound. The sun dipped behind the snow-capped mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, the last rays of light bleeding into a cold, indigo twilight. Inside the main house, the air was thick with the scent of burning oil lamps and the faint sweetness of sagebrush carried in from the hearth. The family had concluded their usual prayers, the younger children sent to bed with whispered lullabies, their small forms disappearing into the dim corridors. Sarah stood in the common room, her hands clasped tightly before her, the fabric of her dress damp with nervous sweat despite the chill that seeped through the walls. The weight of Ezekiel's words from the previous night lingered, a promise of transformation that both beckoned and unnerved her. Rebecca approached with a gentle smile, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners, though the warmth did not quite reach them. She was a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her hands calloused from years of labor. "Come with me, dear sister," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, taking Sarah's hand with a grip that felt both comforting and confining. "Tonight you begin a journey that will transform your understanding of divine love and eternal purpose." The words were a balm, yet they carried an undertone that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She followed Rebecca through the house, the floorboards groaning under their steps, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. They stopped before a door Sarah had never seen open, its wood weathered and darkened by time, blending into the shadowed wall. Rebecca produced a key from the folds of her apron, the metal glinting faintly in the lamplight, and turned it with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. The door revealed a narrow staircase descending into shadow, the air growing cooler with each step, carrying the faint, musty scent of earth and stone. Sarah's breath hitched as she descended, the hem of her dress brushing against the rough steps, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. From below came the faint murmur of voices chanting in unison, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to pulse through the walls, drawing her downward like a siren's call. The chamber they entered was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, a space carved from the earth itself, its walls draped with white cloth that glowed faintly in the candlelight. The flames flickered in intricate patterns, casting a soft, ethereal glow that danced across the room, illuminating an altar at the center. A raised platform covered with a pristine white cloth, surrounded by several women she recognized from the household. They were dressed in flowing white robes, their heads bowed in prayer, their faces obscured by the fall of their hair or the angle of their posture. The air was thick with the scent of sweet-smelling herbs burning in a brass censer, the smoke curling upward in delicate tendrils, mingling with the chants that grew louder as Sarah stepped forward. "Welcome, Sister Sarah," came Ezekiel's voice from the shadows, deep and resonant, cutting through the hum of the room. He emerged wearing a robe similar to the others, the fabric swaying with his movements, his presence commanding and authoritative. His eyes, dark and unyielding, fixed upon her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "Tonight you take the first step toward understanding the sacred mysteries that will bind you to the eternal covenant." As the ceremony began, the chanting softened into a low, hypnotic drone, the women's voices blending with the crackle of the flames. Sarah stood motionless, her breath shallow, as Ezekiel approached with a vial of oil, his hands steady as he anointed her forehead, the liquid cool against her skin. The ritual that followed was a blur of sensation and sound. Prayers murmured in a language she did not recognize, the brush of hands as the women guided her to the altar, the rustle of fabric as her outer garments were removed under the guise of spiritual cleansing. She felt the cold air against her bare arms, the vulnerability of her exposed skin, and a flush of discomfort that she fought to suppress. Ezekiel's voice rose above the others, explaining that modesty was a worldly concern with no place in the presence of divine ordinances. "The body is a temple, Sister Sarah," he said afterward, his hand resting on her shoulder, the pressure firm and possessive. But like all temples, it must be consecrated through sacred ordinances before it can fulfill its divine purpose. What you experienced tonight was merely the beginning of your preparation. Sarah returned to her room that night, her mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. The candlelight flickered as she undressed, the shadows playing across the walls like silent witnesses. She had convinced herself that her discomfort was a sign of her own spiritual immaturity, a test of her faith that she must overcome. Yet, beneath that rationalization lay a seed of doubt, a whisper that grew louder with each passing day. Winter settled over the Utah Territory with a vengeance, blanketing the Lefetti compound in snow that muffled the world outside, the silence pressing against the windows like a physical force. The cold seeped into the bones of the house, the wind howling through the eaves, a sound that mirrored the turmoil within Sarah's soul. Over the next 2 months, she participated in 2 more ceremonies, each more intense and disturbing than the last. The second ritual, held in the same basement chamber, introduced what Ezekiel called a spiritual inspection, a humiliating process that involved his hands and those of the other men, their touches justified as a test of her worthiness. Sarah's skin crawled under their scrutiny, her breath catching in her throat as she fought the urge to pull away. When she later confided her discomfort to Rebecca, the older woman's response was gentle but firm. "I struggled with these same feelings when I first received my calling," Rebecca confided, her voice a whisper as they worked together in the kitchen, the scent of rising bread filling the air. "But I learned that our mortal understanding is limited. Brother Ezekiel sees with spiritual eyes that we cannot comprehend. Trust in his guidance, and you will find peace." The third ceremony crossed lines that Sarah's mind struggled to accept. Held in a different part of the compound, a building she had been told was for grain storage but now revealed its sinister purpose. It was described as a sacred union. The other women held her hands, their whispers of reassurance a hollow comfort as Ezekiel performed acts that bore no resemblance to anything she had been taught about marriage or divine love. The physical pain was sharp, a searing ache that radiated through her body, but the emotional turmoil that followed was a deeper wound, a fracture in her spirit that left her trembling in the aftermath. The room, with its walls lined with religious symbols that seemed to mock the faith they claimed to represent, closed in around her, the candlelight casting grotesque shadows that danced like specters. As she sat in the small chapel for the morning prayers, the snow outside glittering under the weak winter sun, Sarah studied the faces of the other women with new eyes. The room was warm, the air heavy with the scent of melted wax and wool, the soft murmur of devotion a stark contrast to the thoughts churning within her. How many of them had endured similar initiations? How many had learned to accept the unacceptable by convincing themselves it was God's will? Martha, Ezekiel's second wife, led the devotional, her dark hair framing a perpetually serene expression that Sarah had once admired. Now she wondered what thoughts lay hidden behind that peaceful facade, what silent screams echoed in the depths of her mind. "The scriptures teach us that obedience is the first law of heaven," Martha intoned, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered this lesson many times. "When we submit our will to that of our spiritual leaders, we demonstrate our faith and open ourselves to receive the greatest blessings the Lord has to offer." Sarah's stomach churned as she listened, the words that had once brought her comfort now feeling like chains binding her to a reality she could not escape. She glanced around the room at the younger girls, some barely 14, their faces alight with innocence that she knew would soon be stripped away. The weight of their potential suffering pressed against her chest, a burden she could no longer ignore. After the service, as the family dispersed to their daily tasks, Ezekiel approached her with what she had learned to recognize as his revelation face, a solemn intensity that preceded his most disturbing announcements. "Sister Sarah," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, the words brushing against her ear like a cold wind. "The Lord has revealed to me that you are ready for the next phase of your spiritual education. Tonight, you will participate in the covenant of eternal binding. This sacred ordinance will seal your commitment to the principles we practice here and ensure your place in the celestial kingdom." The blood drained from Sarah's face, her vision narrowing as panic surged within her. She had heard whispers about this particular ceremony from the other women, their cryptic terms hinting at something far more intense than anything she had yet experienced. "Brother Ezekiel," she began hesitantly, her voice trembling, "I'm not certain I'm spiritually prepared for such a sacred responsibility. Perhaps I could spend more time in prayer and fasting to ensure my worthiness." His expression hardened almost imperceptibly, a shadow passing over his features that made her heart skip. "Sister Sarah, are you questioning the revelation I have received concerning your spiritual progress? Such doubt is a dangerous path that leads away from salvation and toward the darkness of apostasy." The word apostasy hung in the air like a physical threat, its weight pressing against her lungs. Sarah had seen what happened to those branded with that label: ostracism from the community, loss of family connections, and condemnation to what their doctrine taught was eternal damnation. For someone like her, with no family or resources outside the compound, it would mean not just spiritual death but likely physical death as well in the harsh Utah wilderness. "No, Brother Ezekiel," she said quickly, lowering her eyes in what she hoped appeared to be humble submission, her hands clenching into fists beneath her skirts. "I trust in your spiritual guidance. I will prepare myself as you direct." "Good," he replied, his tone warming slightly, a predator's smile curling his lips. "Sister Constance will help you with the necessary preparations. Remember, child, the path to exaltation requires sacrifices that the spiritually immature cannot understand. But those who endure to the end shall receive a crown of eternal glory." As Ezekiel walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, Sarah felt a presence beside her and turned to find Constance, the youngest of his wives. At 19, she was only 3 years older than Sarah, but her eyes held a weariness that seemed to belong to someone much older, shadowed by secrets and sorrow. "Come with me," Constance said softly, taking Sarah's arm with a grip that trembled slightly. They walked in silence to a small storage room behind the kitchen, the air thick with the scent of flour and dried herbs. Constance carefully closed the door and turned to face Sarah, her expression a mask of barely controlled anguish. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered urgently, her voice cracking with emotion. "What happens tonight? It will change you forever. I need you to understand that whatever you have to do to survive it, whatever you have to tell yourself to get through it, none of it is your fault. Do you understand me?" Sarah stared at her in shock, the words striking her like a thunderclap. This was the first time anyone had spoken so directly about the reality of life in the compound, a crack in the facade that exposed the rot beneath. "Constance, what are you saying? Are you suggesting that Brother Ezekiel's revelations are—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Constance interrupted, glancing nervously at the door, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "I'm simply telling you that survival sometimes requires us to protect our minds in ways that others might not understand. Tonight, when it becomes too much to bear, find a place inside yourself where you can go. A place where none of this can touch you." Before Sarah could respond, Constance had opened the door and was gone, leaving her alone with the terrifying realization that she was trapped in a situation far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening as the weight of the coming night settled upon her shoulders. As the day wore on and evening approached, Sarah found herself praying, not for spiritual enlightenment or divine guidance, but simply for the strength to survive whatever was coming. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, a beauty that felt mocking against the dread in her heart. Rebecca came to collect her as dusk fell, her face a mask of forced calm, and they descended not to the basement chamber but to a different part of the compound, a building Sarah had been told was used for grain storage. The air grew colder as they approached, the scent of mold and earth rising from the ground, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it served a far more sinister purpose. The room they entered was larger than the previous ceremonial space, its walls lined with religious symbols and imagery that seemed to twist the faith she had known into something grotesque. The other participants were already present, not just the women of the household, but several men Sarah recognized as prominent members of the local church leadership. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, were stern and unyielding, their presence a confirmation of her worst fears. As the ceremony began, Sarah understood with crystal clarity that she was no longer simply a victim of one man's twisted interpretation of religious doctrine. She was trapped within a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Lefetti compound, involving respected members of the community who had found ways to justify the unjustifiable in the name of divine revelation. The ritual that unfolded in the grain storage building seared itself into Sarah's memory, a nightmare etched in the flickering candlelight and the cold stone walls. The air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the metallic tang of fear, the chants of the gathered men and women rising and falling like a tide against her resolve. The ceremony, dubbed the Covenant of Eternal Binding by Ezekiel, was a grotesque parody of the sacred unions she had been taught to revere. His hands, rough and unyielding, moved with a purpose that stripped away her dignity, while the other women, Rebecca, Martha, Constance, held her wrists, their whispers of reassurance a hollow echo in the cavernous space. The pain was a sharp, searing intrusion, but the deeper wound was the betrayal, the realization that these acts were not divine but a calculated tool of control. The room spun around her, the religious symbols on the walls blurring into a mockery of faith, their lines twisting like the faces of the men who watched with cold approval. When it was over, Sarah was escorted back to her room by Rebecca, her legs trembling beneath her, the hem of her dress dragging through the dust of the corridor. The silence between them was oppressive, broken only by the soft crunch of snow underfoot as they passed a window. Rebecca's face was a mask of forced calm, her eyes averted, but Sarah caught the flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or fear, in the older woman's expression. Alone in her small room, the candle snuffed out by a draft, Sarah curled into herself on the narrow bed, the coarse blanket scratching against her skin. The events replayed in her mind, each detail a shard of glass cutting deeper into her soul. She had been taught that suffering was sacred, that silence was worship, but now those lessons felt like chains forged to bind her to a lie. Spring arrived late in the Utah Territory that year, the snow lingering into April before giving way to a tentative thaw. The landscape transformed slowly, the valley awakening with the green of new grass and the trill of returning birds, a renewal that seemed to mock the darkness that had settled over Sarah's spirit. 6 months had passed since her arrival at the Lefetti compound, and she had learned to navigate the complex web of secrets and silence that governed daily life within its walls. The Covenant of Eternal Binding had been everything Constance's warning had suggested and worse, a carefully orchestrated form of psychological and physical control designed to break down any remaining resistance to Ezekiel's authority. The presence of other church leaders had served a dual purpose: to legitimize the proceedings in the minds of the participants and to ensure that everyone present was equally complicit in the abuse. In the weeks that followed, Sarah watched as other young women underwent similar initiations. She saw the light fade from their eyes, their spirits fragmenting into pieces they hid away from the horror of their daily reality. The kitchen, where she often worked alongside Rebecca, became a stage for these silent tragedies. Girls no older than herself moving mechanically, their hands trembling as they kneaded dough or scrubbed pots, their gazes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. But Sarah also began to notice cracks in the facade that Ezekiel and his associates worked so hard to maintain. Whispered conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room, nervous glances exchanged between the men when they thought no one was watching. The gradual disappearance of women who had once been part of the inner circle added to her growing suspicion. One morning, as she hung laundry behind the main house, the warm April sun beating down on her shoulders, Sarah asked Rebecca about Sister Elizabeth, a woman in her 20s who had been present at several ceremonies but had not been seen for over a month. The air was filled with the scent of damp cloth and the distant lowing of cattle, the rhythm of her task a temporary distraction from her thoughts. Rebecca's face paled, her hands fumbling with a towel as she busied herself with unnecessary tasks. Sister Elizabeth was called to serve in another settlement, she said, her voice tight. Brother Ezekiel received a revelation that her talents were needed elsewhere. But Sarah had seen the fear in Rebecca's eyes, a flicker of truth beneath the lie, and she began to understand that serving elsewhere might be a euphemism for something far more permanent and sinister. It was during this time of growing awareness that Sarah encountered Jacob Morrison, a young man whose presence at the compound had always puzzled her. Unlike the other men who visited for ceremonies or business, Jacob moved through the household with a freedom that suggested he belonged, yet he participated in none of the religious activities and often appeared deeply troubled by what he witnessed. His dark hair fell into his eyes, his frame lean from years of labor, and his gaze carried a weight that spoke of burdens he did not share. Their first real conversation occurred on that warm April morning, the laundry line sagging under the weight of wet sheets, the breeze carrying the scent of earth and blossoms. Sarah had been lost in thought, trying to process the previous night's spiritual instruction, a session that had left her shaking and silent when she became aware of someone watching her. Turning, she found Jacob standing near the garden gate, his expression a mixture of sympathy and barely controlled anger. The gate creaked as he shifted his weight, the sound cutting through the stillness. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed, his voice low and urgent. "I know what they're doing to you, to all of you." Sarah's heart began to race, a flush of adrenaline warming her cheeks. In the months since her arrival, no one had spoken so directly about the reality of life in the compound. "I don't know what you mean," she replied automatically. The response drilled into her through months of conditioning, her hands pausing on the wet fabric. Jacob stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of confession. "My name is Jacob Morrison. Ezekiel Lafetti is my uncle, and I've been living here for 2 years. I've seen things that would make decent people sick to their stomachs. I know you're suffering, and I know you feel trapped, but I want you to understand that what's happening here isn't God's will. It's the work of sick men who use religion to justify their perversions." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, shattering the fragile defenses she had built around her doubts. For months, she had struggled with questions she had been taught to suppress as signs of spiritual weakness. To hear someone else, someone who had witnessed the same horrors, validate her instincts was both liberating and terrifying. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes, the laundry basket trembling in her hands. "If you know what they're capable of, why would you risk?" "Because I can't stand by and watch anymore," Jacob interrupted, his own voice thick with emotion, his fists clenching at his sides. "I've been documenting everything I've seen, keeping records of the women who have disappeared, the children who have been damaged. I'm planning to take this information to the territorial authorities, but I need someone on the inside who can provide testimony about what really happens during those ceremonies." Sarah felt a surge of hope followed immediately by crushing fear, the two emotions warring within her chest. The sun seemed to dim as clouds gathered overhead, casting a shadow across the yard. "They'll kill us both if they find out," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't understand the power they have, the connections." "I understand more than you think," Jacob said grimly, his gaze steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Some of those men you've seen at the ceremonies hold positions in the territorial government. Others are wealthy merchants who fund church activities throughout the valley. This corruption goes deeper than just one compound, Sarah. But that's exactly why it has to be stopped." Over the following weeks, Sarah and Jacob began meeting in secret, usually during the early morning hours when the household was still asleep, the pre-dawn silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant crow of a rooster. In a hidden corner of the barn, surrounded by the scent of hay and the soft snorts of sleeping horses, Jacob shared the journal he had been keeping, a detailed record of dates, participants, and activities that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning years. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed and creased, the ink smudged from hurried entries. "Look at this," he said one morning, the gray light filtering through the barn's cracks as he turned to entries from the previous year. 3 women have simply vanished in the past 12 months. All of them were participants in the ceremonies, and all of them had begun showing signs of resistance or questioning. The official story is always the same: they were called to serve elsewhere or they chose to leave the faith, but I've made inquiries. None of them ever arrived at their supposed destinations. Sarah studied the entries with growing horror, her fingers tracing the names. Elizabeth among them, the woman whose disappearance Rebecca had explained away so nervously. "What do you think happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rustling straw. Jacob's expression was grim, his eyes shadowed by the dim light. "I think they were silenced permanently. There's a mine shaft about 10 miles north of here that's been abandoned for years. I've seen Ezekiel and some of the other men make trips in that direction, always at night, always returning before dawn." The implications of his words made Sarah's blood run cold, the barn's warmth suddenly insufficient against the chill that gripped her. She had known the situation was dangerous, but she had never imagined it might be deadly for those who tried to escape or expose the truth. "There's something else," Jacob continued, his voice barely audible, the sound swallowed by the barn's wooden walls. "I've been in contact with a federal marshal named Thomas Brennan. He's been investigating reports of unusual activities in Mormon settlements throughout the territory. He's agreed to meet with us, but he needs concrete evidence and first-hand testimony." "When?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, the question hanging between them like a lifeline. "Next month," Jacob replied. "There's a church conference in Salt Lake City that most of the leadership will attend. It would be the perfect opportunity for us to slip away and meet with Marshal Brennan without being missed immediately." As they finalized their plans, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and determination she had never experienced before. The barn's shadows seemed to close in, the scent of hay mingling with the musk of fear. She understood that she was risking everything: her life, her safety, and any hope of a normal future. But she also understood that remaining silent would mean condemning other young women to the same fate she had endured, and possibly worse. What she didn't know was that their conversations had not gone entirely unnoticed. Constance, who had been watching Sarah with growing concern, had observed the secret meetings and drawn her own conclusions about what was being planned. Torn between her desire to protect Sarah and her fear of the consequences, she faced an impossible choice that would ultimately determine the fate of everyone involved. The morning of May 15, 1871, dawned clear and cold, the crispness in the air carrying a promise of either new beginnings or final endings that hung over the Lefetti compound like a shroud. The first light filtered through the frost-laced windows, casting a pale glow across the snow-dusted yard, where the crunch of boots on gravel and the low moo of cattle broke the silence. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with the details of the plan she and Jacob had carefully constructed over the past month. The journal, its pages a testament to their shared resolve, lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, its leather cover worn smooth by her trembling fingers. Today, while Ezekiel and most of the compound's leadership traveled to Salt Lake City for the church conference, she and Jacob would make their escape to meet with Federal Marshal Thomas Brennan. The thought of freedom mingled with terror, her heart pounding as she dressed in the dim light, the coarse fabric of her dress scratching against her skin. What Sarah didn't know was that Constance had spent an equally sleepless night wrestling with a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The small room she shared with Martha was stifling, the air thick with the scent of tallow candles and the faint musk of wool blankets. She had watched Sarah's growing determination with a mixture of admiration and terror, knowing that any attempt to expose the truth would likely result in death for everyone involved. But she had also seen too many young women disappear into the darkness. Elizabeth, whose name still lingered like a ghost, and others whose faces faded from memory as quickly as they vanished. The weight of her complicity pressed against her chest, a burden she could no longer bear. As the household prepared for the departure of the men, their voices a low hum in the distance, Constance made her choice. She approached Ezekiel in his study, where he reviewed documents for the conference, the scratch of his pen a stark contrast to the pounding of her heart. "Brother Ezekiel," she said softly, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door, the wood cold under her knuckles. He looked up from his papers, noting the distress in her voice, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "What troubles you, Sister Constance? I believe there may be a threat to the security of our sacred work," she began, the words feeling like poison on her tongue, each syllable a betrayal of the girl she had tried to protect. With tears streaming down her face, she revealed what she had witnessed: the secret meetings between Sarah and Jacob, the documents she had seen Jacob carrying, and her suspicions about their true purpose. The room seemed to shrink around her, the scent of ink and leather growing overpowering as she spoke. As she finished, she watched Ezekiel's face transform from concern to cold fury, his hands clenching the papers until they crumpled. "You have done well to bring this to my attention," he said finally, his voice deadly calm, the words slicing through the silence like a blade. "The Lord rewards those who protect his sacred mysteries from the corruption of the world. Return to your duties and speak of this to no one. I will handle this matter personally." As Constance left the study, the door clicking shut behind her, she felt as though she had signed Sarah's death warrant. Her steps faltered in the hallway, the cold stone floor seeping through her shoes, and she leaned against the wall, her breath ragged. But she also knew that if she had remained silent and the plan had succeeded, Ezekiel's revenge would have been swift and terrible for everyone in the compound. The weight of her choice settled upon her, a shadow that followed her as she rejoined the others. Meanwhile, Sarah was making her final preparations, carefully packing a small bag with essential items, a worn shawl, a crust of bread, and the few pieces of evidence she had been able to gather, including a scrap of paper with Jacob's notes. The room was dim, the candle's flame casting long shadows across the walls, each flicker a reminder of the danger ahead. Jacob had arranged to meet her at an abandoned cabin 5 miles from the compound, where they would wait until evening before making the journey to their rendezvous with Marshal Brennan. The plan was simple yet fraught with risk, the distance a daunting prospect across the rugged terrain. As the morning progressed and the time for departure approached, Sarah noticed an unusual tension in the household. The other women seemed nervous and distracted, their hands fumbling with chores, their gazes darting toward her with expressions she couldn't quite interpret, pity, perhaps, or fear. When Rebecca approached her with instructions for additional chores that would keep her busy throughout the day, Sarah began to suspect that something was wrong. The kitchen was warm, the air filled with the scent of simmering stew, but Rebecca's voice carried an edge of urgency. "Sister Rebecca," Sarah said carefully, pausing with a potato in her hand, its skin rough under her fingers. "I was hoping to spend some time in private prayer this afternoon. I've been feeling spiritually troubled lately and thought some solitude might help." Rebecca's face flushed slightly, her hands tightening around a wooden spoon. "I'm afraid that won't be possible today, dear. Brother Ezekiel left specific instructions that all the women should remain together for mutual support while the men are away. We'll be holding a special prayer circle this evening that will require everyone's participation." The mention of a prayer circle sent chills down Sarah's spine, the words echoing with the memory of past ceremonies. She had learned that such gatherings often preceded the most disturbing rituals, and the timing seemed far too coincidental. Her suspicions were confirmed when she noticed that several of the men who should have departed for Salt Lake City were still present on the compound, their figures lurking in the shadows, their voices a low murmur beyond the walls. As the afternoon wore on, the tension thickened, the air growing heavy with unspoken threats. Sarah realized that her plan had been discovered and that she was now in immediate danger. The question was whether Jacob had also been compromised or if he was still waiting for her at the cabin, unaware that their escape route had been cut off. When evening arrived, Sarah was escorted to the basement chamber by Rebecca and Martha, both of whom avoided meeting her eyes, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The room had been prepared for what Ezekiel called a purification ritual, a ceremony she had learned was reserved for those who had committed serious transgressions against the community's sacred laws. The walls were draped with white cloth, the candles arranged in a circle around the altar, their flames casting a sickly glow. Ezekiel was waiting for her, his robe swaying as he moved, his presence a dark anchor in the room. Beside him stood several other men whose presence confirmed her worst fears. Brother Nathaniel Crowley, known for his zealous enforcement of church discipline, and Brother Samuel Hartwell, whose wealth and political connections made him a formidable figure. "Sister Sarah," Ezekiel began, his voice carrying the tone of disappointed authority that she had learned to fear above all others, the words reverberating off the stone walls. "It has come to my attention that you have been entertaining thoughts and engaging in activities that threaten the sacred covenant you made with this family and with God himself. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, the sound a drumbeat against her ribs. But she forced herself to maintain eye contact with Ezekiel, her hands clenching at her sides. "I don't understand what you mean, Brother Ezekiel. I have tried to be faithful to all the teachings you have shared with me." "Have you?" he asked, stepping closer, his breath warm against her face, his eyes boring into hers. "Then perhaps you can explain why you have been meeting secretly with my nephew Jacob, discussing matters that should remain within the sacred circle of the initiated." The question hit her like a physical blow, the air rushing from her lungs. If they knew about her meetings with Jacob, then they almost certainly knew about the planned escape and possibly about Marshall Brennan as well. She realized that any hope of rescue was gone, and that her only chance of survival lay in convincing them that she posed no real threat. "Jacob approached me with questions about our faith," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, the words tasting like ash. "I thought it was my duty to help him understand the sacred principles we practice here. If I said anything inappropriate, it was only due to my own spiritual immaturity." Brother Crowley stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating, his voice a low growl. "Sister Sarah, we have evidence that suggests your conversations with Jacob went far beyond religious instruction. We know that he has been keeping records of our sacred ceremonies, and that he has been in contact with outside authorities who seek to persecute us for our beliefs." The mention of outside authorities confirmed Sarah's worst fears. If they knew about Marshall Brennan, then Jacob was almost certainly walking into a trap. She had to find a way to warn him, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process. "I swear to you that I knew nothing about any records or outside contacts," she said, allowing desperation to creep into her voice, her hands trembling as she clasped them before her. "Jacob never mentioned anything like that to me. If he has been deceiving us all, then I am as shocked as you are." Ezekiel studied her face for a long moment, the silence stretching taut, then nodded to Brother Hartwell, who produced a leather-bound journal that Sarah recognized with a sinking heart as Jacob's documentation of the compound's activities. The cover was scarred, the pages bulging with evidence of his meticulous record-keeping. "This journal was found in Jacob's room this afternoon," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, the words slicing through the room. "It contains detailed accounts of our sacred ceremonies, along with the names of participants and dates of specific events. More troubling still, it contains correspondence with a federal marshal who has been investigating our community." As Hartwell read selected passages, the candlelight flickering over the pages, Sarah felt her last hopes crumbling, the weight of the evidence a stone upon her chest. She knew that any attempt to maintain her innocence would only prolong the inevitable. But she also realized that Jacob's capture meant that Marshall Brennan would never receive the testimony and evidence needed to expose the truth about the compound. "Where is Jacob now?" she asked, abandoning any pretense of ignorance, her voice a whisper against the oppressive silence. "Jacob has been dealt with according to the sacred laws that govern our community," Ezekiel replied, his tone suggesting that further questions on that subject would not be welcome, his eyes narrowing with a cold finality. "The question now is what to do with you, Sister Sarah. Your involvement in this betrayal has placed not just our family, but our entire way of life in jeopardy." As the men discussed her fate in voices too low for her to hear clearly, the candle flames guttering in the draft, Sarah found herself thinking not of her own survival, but of the other young women who would continue to suffer if the truth about the compound never came to light. She thought of the names in Jacob's journal, the women who had disappeared, the children who had been damaged, the systematic corruption that extended far beyond these walls. In that moment, as the shadows deepened around her, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life, however long or short it might be. If she was going to die, she would not die quietly. She would make sure that her voice was heard, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The ceremony that followed would be unlike any that had been conducted in the compound before. For the first time, one of the victims would refuse to remain silent. Sarah's defiance would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring down everything Ezekiel Lefetti had built. But the price of that victory would be higher than anyone could have imagined. The winter of 1871 descended upon the Utah Territory with a ferocity that etched itself into the land, the snow piling high against the Lefetti compound's walls, its whiteness a stark contrast to the darkness within. The wind howled through the eaves, a mournful wail that carried the scent of pine and frozen earth, while inside, the air was thick with the musk of wool blankets and the faint bitterness of smoked meat preserved for the season. In the 3 months since Sarah's confrontation with Ezekiel and his associates, the carefully constructed world of secrets and silence had begun to collapse in ways that no one could have predicted. The basement chamber, where her defiance had erupted, still bore the echoes of her screams, the white cloths stained with the memory of her struggle, the candles reduced to puddles of wax on the stone floor. Sarah's refusal to submit quietly to her fate had created a problem that Ezekiel and his followers were ill-equipped to handle. Unlike the other women who had been dealt with in the past, silenced through fear or disappearance, Sarah had fought back with a fury that shocked everyone present. Her screams had pierced the night, reverberating through the compound's corridors, carrying accusations that named specific men, dates, and details with a clarity that could not be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. The words had tumbled from her lips, raw and unfiltered, a litany of horrors that included the disappearance of Elizabeth and the abuse of children too young to understand. The men had tried to gag her, their hands rough against her mouth, but her voice had already taken flight, seeding doubt among those who heard. More troubling still, her defiance had inspired something Ezekiel had never encountered before: open rebellion among the other women. Rebecca, who had been part of the inner circle for over a decade, broke down completely after witnessing Sarah's treatment. The kitchen, where she had once moved with practiced efficiency, became her confessional. As she kneaded dough, tears streaked her flour-dusted face, her voice a whisper against the clatter of pots. "I can no longer participate in what I now recognize as evil," she confessed to Sarah one frigid morning, the fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth failing to reach the chill in her bones. Martha, Ezekiel's second wife, took a bolder step. One night, under a sky heavy with snow, she disappeared with her 2 youngest children, leaving behind a letter tucked beneath a candle holder in the common room. The paper, creased and tear-stained, detailed years of abuse and manipulation, its words a silent scream that would later fuel the investigation. But it was Constance who delivered the most devastating blow to Ezekiel's authority. Consumed by guilt over her role in Sarah's capture, she had spent sleepless nights pacing her small room, the floorboards creaking under her restless steps, the scent of tallow candles mingling with her despair. On a cold December morning, the ground crunching underfoot as she made her way to Salt Lake City, she walked into the office of Territorial Governor George Woods. The room was austere, its wooden desk scarred by time, the air heavy with the smell of ink and leather-bound ledgers. With trembling hands, she told him everything she knew about the Lefetti compound, the ceremonies, the disappearances, the network of corruption. Governor Woods, who had been receiving disturbing reports about various Mormon settlements for months, immediately contacted Federal Marshal Thomas Brennan, the same man Jacob had been trying to reach. Within days, a federal investigation was launched, its tendrils reaching into the compound and beyond. The investigation revealed that Jacob Morrison's journal, which Ezekiel thought he had destroyed, had actually been copied before his capture. Jacob, anticipating that his activities might be discovered, had hidden duplicate records in multiple locations, beneath a loose stone in the barn, inside a hollowed-out Bible in the chapel, and had arranged for them to be delivered to Marshal Brennan if he failed to make their scheduled meeting. The realization that his nephew's foresight had outmaneuvered him sent Ezekiel into a rage, his shouts echoing through the study as he smashed a chair against the wall, the wood splintering under his hands. When federal agents arrived at the compound in January 1872, they found a scene that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The basement chambers yielded evidence of systematic abuse. Ropes stained with blood, journals detailing rituals, scraps of fabric that once clothed the victims, while the abandoned mine shaft 10 miles north, its entrance choked with snow, revealed the remains of 7 women and 3 children, their bones a silent testament to the conspiracy's brutality. Ezekiel Lafferty and 12 of his associates were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, sexual assault, and conspiracy. The trials that followed became some of the most sensational in territorial history. The courtroom in Salt Lake City packed with spectators, the air thick with the murmur of voices and the rustle of newspapers. Testimony shocked even the most hardened observers. The details of the ceremonies laid bare with a precision that left no room for doubt. Sarah, who had survived her ordeal but bore physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal, her wrists marked by rope burns, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, became the prosecution's star witness. Her testimony, delivered with a strength that amazed everyone who heard it, provided the first-hand account needed to secure convictions. The courtroom was a cavernous space, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of the crowd, the sunlight streaming through high windows casting harsh lines across the floor. Sarah stood at the witness stand, her voice clear and unwavering despite the tears streaming down her face, the sound of her words cutting through the silence. "They told us it was God's will," she said, her hands gripping the railing, the wood smooth under her fingers. "They convinced us that our suffering was sacred, that our silence was a form of worship. But I learned that evil can wear the mask of righteousness and that the most dangerous predators are often those who claim to speak for God." The jury, their faces a mixture of horror and resolve, listened as she recounted the rituals, the disappearances, the manipulation that had ensnared her and so many others. The trials revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, implicating not just the men directly involved in the abuse, but also territorial officials who had received bribes to ignore reports of suspicious activities. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, D.C., where it contributed to growing federal pressure for reform in the Utah Territory, the corridors of power buzzing with debates over religious autonomy and criminal accountability. Ezekiel Lafetti was sentenced to death by hanging, the sentence carried out on a gray morning in March 1873. The gallows stood stark against the sky, the crowd silent as the trapdoor dropped, the thud of his body a final punctuation to his reign. His last words, according to witnesses, were not expressions of remorse but continued claims that he had been persecuted for his religious beliefs. He went to his death maintaining that his actions had been divinely inspired, a delusion that even the prospect of eternity could not shake. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from life imprisonment to lengthy prison terms, effectively dismantling the network that had operated with impunity for so many years. The compound itself was seized by federal authorities, its buildings stripped of their sanctity, the air within growing stale as it stood empty. The proceeds from its eventual sale were used to establish a fund for the survivors and the families of the victims, a small recompense for the lives shattered. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the investigation was its impact on the broader Mormon community in Utah. The revelations forced church leaders to confront the reality that their isolation and autonomy had created conditions where abuse could flourish unchecked. New oversight mechanisms were established, and federal authorities were given greater access to investigate reports of criminal activity in religious communities. The valley's landscape forever altered by the shadow of reform. Sarah, who had been offered federal protection and assistance in relocating to another territory, chose instead to remain in Utah. She established a small school for children who had been traumatized by their experiences in various compounds, the building a modest structure of wood and stone, its windows letting in the healing light of day. The air inside was filled with the scent of chalk and paper, the sound of young voices a balm to her wounded spirit. She dedicated her life to helping others heal from the wounds she understood all too well, her hands guiding trembling fingers through lessons, her voice offering hope where there had been despair. "I could have run away and tried to forget," she wrote in a letter to Marshall Brennan years later, the ink smudged by a tear, the paper creased from rereading. "But I realized that my survival meant something only if I used it to prevent others from suffering as I had suffered. The scars I carry are reminders not just of what was done to me, but of what I was able to overcome." Jacob Morrison's body was never found, his fate remaining one of the investigation's unsolved mysteries. Some believed he had been killed immediately after his capture, his remains lost in the mine shaft, while others held out hope that he had somehow escaped and was living under an assumed name in another territory. Sarah preferred to believe the latter, finding comfort in the thought that his courage had not been rewarded with death. her mind conjuring images of him walking free under a different sky. The Lefetti compound stood empty for several years, its buildings slowly deteriorating under the harsh Utah weather, the wind whistling through broken windows, the scent of decay rising from the earth. Local residents reported strange sounds. Moans carried on the breeze, footsteps where none should be, leading many to believe that the site was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. Eventually, the buildings were torn down, the land converted to agricultural use, the soil tilled to erase the past. But the memory of what had occurred there continued to serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. In the decades that followed, Sarah's story became part of the historical record of the American West, a reminder that the frontier's promise of freedom and opportunity had often come at a terrible cost for those who lacked the power to protect themselves. Her courage in speaking truth to power had helped expose one of the darkest chapters in the territory's history, her voice a beacon that guided others toward justice. But it had also demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming evil, the human spirit could find the strength to resist and ultimately prevail. The most disturbing sexual rituals of the Lefetti family had finally been brought to light. The price of that revelation measured in lives lost, innocence destroyed, and faith shattered. Yet from that darkness had emerged a truth that would echo through the generations. That silence in the face of evil is complicity, and that the courage to speak out, no matter the cost, is sometimes the only thing that stands between civilization and barbarism. As Sarah grew older, her hair turning silver, her hands marked by time, she often reflected on the events that had shaped her life so profoundly. She never married, never had children of her own, but she touched hundreds of lives through her work with traumatized children and her advocacy for stronger protections for the vulnerable. The school became her legacy, its walls a sanctuary where laughter and learning drowned out the echoes of the past. When she died in 1923 at the age of 68, her funeral was attended by people from across the western United States. Survivors, investigators, reformers, and ordinary citizens who understood that her courage had made their world a safer place. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and the soft murmur of prayers, the crowd a testament to her impact. The inscription on her gravestone, chosen by the children she had helped over the years, read simply, "She broke the silence." It was perhaps the most fitting epitaph for a woman who had learned that sometimes the most sacred act is not submission but resistance in the name of truth and justice.